Welcome to Going Antiviral, the podcast for the IAS-USA, a professional continuing medical education organization focused on HIV and other viral diseases. I'm Dr. Michael Sagg, professor of medicine and infectious diseases at the University of Alabama at Birmingham and volunteer member of the IAS-USA Board of Directors. In this episode of Going Antiviral, we represent the Martin Delaney presentation given by Rebecca Denison at the 2025 Conference on Retroviruses and Opportunistic Infections, CROI, entitled 40 Plus Years of HIV, What's Changed, What Hasn't, What Shouldn't, What Must. Ms. Denison is the founder of Women Organized to Respond to Life-Threatening Disease, or WORLD. Rebecca's presentation was viewed by most of the attendees at CROI as one of the best and most moving presentations. We're very pleased to present this special episode of Going Antiviral right now. Rebecca, take it away.
Oh, there's a lot of you. Wow. Okay. Thank you, Dawn, and thank you to the CROI committee for the opportunity to be here today. And welcome delegates to the beautiful state of California. No? How does this work? Here we go. I know you probably won't have time to go see the redwood trees, so I brought them to you. I'm humbled and honored to speak to you as one of the nearly 40 million people living with HIV, more than half of whom are women. I say humbled because I know there's no way I can speak on behalf of everyone who deserves to be uplifted at this time. I'm aware of the countless unearned privileges that I have as a white, heterosexual, cisgender, relatively able-bodied person born in the United States. Unlike many of my gay male friends in San Francisco, I did not lose my biological family to stigma, only to move to the Castro district and lose every single one of my friends to AIDS, not once, but twice. As a white woman, I can speak up about injustice without being called an angry black woman or being accused of playing the race card. I'm free to unequivocally state that transgender and non-binary people have always existed and always will. I also have no idea where this microphone is supposed to be. It seems kind of echoey. Is it echoey, or are we okay? We're okay, all right. I say also that I'm honored because as a person without a job or official affiliation with any organization, I have the additional privilege of being able to speak my mind, to say all the currently forbidden words, which CROI said I could say, without fear that my organization or institution will be punished by an administration hell-bent on hurting people. I'd like to begin with a brief moment to recognize who's in the room. As I look around at all of you, I see scientists, clinicians, activists, donors, and journalists whose work saved my life. I mean this in the most sincere way possible. Your work saved my life. Most Americans don't, I also want to acknowledge how your work set the stage for the people who did not care about HIV to nonetheless benefit from HIV science when the COVID pandemic hit. Most Americans don't know that while we waited 4 years for a test for HIV, they got one for SARS-CoV-2 in 4 weeks because of us, because of you. Or that while we are still waiting for a vaccine for HIV, they got a vaccine for SARS-CoV-2 in a year. The work our president now threatens to cut as waste and abuse is work that has saved millions of lives. So let us also take a moment of silence to honor those who are not here in the room today. The 40 million people with HIV who've already died, and the many friends and colleagues who have since January 20th lost their jobs or been able to join us due to travel bans and funding cuts. I'm glad some of you are able to join us virtually. Okay, so now let me tell you a little bit about why I'm here. I was 21 when I acquired HIV. Just a kid in college with big dreams of falling in love, getting a dream job, having children, and leaving the world better than I found it. 7 years later, in June of 1990, I was recently married, working a block away from here as an immigration paralegal, and about to start law school when a friend told me that her sister had AIDS. My friend was afraid to get tested. "You'll be fine," I said. She was so paranoid. "I'll go with you." My friend was fine, but I was not. My test was positive. My first horrified thought was that now I'd never be able to have a baby. The next was how did I get it and whether my husband had it too. Then how would I tell my parents? And finally the realization that I was going to die. Because back then in 1990, it was understood we were all going to die. On my way out of the door of Health Center number 1, the counselor advised, "Most people find it safer to not tell too many people." Other than telling my husband and my closest friends, my plan was to remain silent. But you know who wasn't silent? The AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, also known as ACT UP. Three days after my diagnosis, the International AIDS Conference opened in San Francisco, and every day activists from all over the world were protesting in the streets. In fact, on the day my husband was supposed to get the results of his HIV test, they shut down Market Street a block from my office, chanting, "AIDS is a disaster, women die faster." I had learned in college that the personal is political and that the political is personal, but now I was living it. That chant terrified me. Someone handed me a flyer saying men died on average 18 months after an AIDS diagnosis, but women died after only 6. I remember counting 6 months from the day of my HIV diagnosis. From June 16th, 6 months would be December 16th. And I wondered how I could capture just 2 more weeks to get one last Christmas with my family. But my second emotion was gratitude. Who were these people laying their lives on the line? I wasn't ready to be so bold and outspoken yet, but I was inspired. And they had these t-shirts that seemed to be speaking directly to me. They said, "Silence equals death." An hour later, my husband received his HIV negative test result. I decided the activists were right. Trying to remain silent while my world imploded was killing me. That same night, we shared the news of my diagnosis with his parents and 10 siblings, who were very supportive. My family in Oregon was also very supportive. Then I tried to reach a college boyfriend I hadn't heard from in 6 years. I eventually reached a relative who very reluctantly acknowledged that he had died of AIDS 2 months before my diagnosis. The next day, after the international conference ended, I joined the HIV Unity March down Market Street. Activists, scientists, clinicians, and policymakers, including some of you here in this room. Something about all of us in the struggle together filled me with a courage that I had not felt before. When a gay immigration lawyer I had worked with asked me why I was there, I told him I just got diagnosed. It seemed like a good idea. I have been out about my HIV status ever since. Okay. At first, I didn't know anything, but over time, I learned how women and children of color were disproportionately impacted by HIV, not by a little, but by a lot. And I'm sorry to report that that has not changed. I also learned that activists were suing the CDC to make them update their case definition of AIDS to include women-specific conditions, because HIV-positive women, like Katrina Haslip in New York, were being denied disability. She actually died without ever receiving a diagnosis of AIDS. Then I learned that in June 1983, while I had been fighting a mystery illness my doctors could not explain, in other words, while I was seroconverting, a group of gay men living with AIDS had taken the stage at a conference to present what would become the founding document of our movement, the Denver Principles. Drafted before the term HIV had been coined, the document stated, "We condemn attempts to label us as victims, a term which implies defeat. And we are only occasionally patients, a term which implies passivity, helplessness, and dependence upon the care of others. We are people with AIDS." It went on to recommend protections from being fired, evicted, or socially isolated, to call on people with AIDS to form caucuses to represent their own interests, and to have the right to die and live in dignity. Subsequent activists have added to this foundation with JIPA, MIPA, insistence that the U.S. National AIDS Strategy include metrics for measuring quality of life, and the San Francisco Principles, which call for greater attention and resources to support the challenges of people doctors never expected to treat, long-term survivors. It's attention that is desperately needed now as we struggle to get our heart disease, diabetes, hepatitis, cancer, depression, HIV, and other doctors to talk to one another. Together, these and other declarations from communities of people living with HIV add up to the same battle cry: nothing about us without us. By the time I joined ACT UP, they had split into two groups. ACT UP Golden Gate was focused on research because without better drugs, we were all going to die. ACT UP San Francisco focused on social justice because even if better drugs were discovered, those who couldn't access them would still die. And you know what? They were both right. I felt terribly out of place the first time I attended one of ACT UP's brunches for newcomers. I was, once again, the only HIV-positive woman in a room of gay men. They wore cool clothes, and I still dressed like an Oregon farm girl, which I was. But when I tried to sneak out, a kind man named Hank Wilson stopped me at the door, laid a warm hand on my shoulder, and he said, "Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for coming. We need you." Those 4 words changed my life. I spent the next many months wondering, need me for what? I share this story because when I felt I had nothing to offer, these people saw something in me that I did not see in myself. It's a power that we all have to uplift, encourage, mentor, and support current and future generations. It took me a while to figure out how I could contribute. In the meantime, I saved the name and phone number of every HIV-positive woman I could find. Every month, I would attend Martin Delaney's Project Informed town hall meetings, where I would hear about scientific updates months before the breaking news would hit the press. But I was almost always the only openly HIV-positive woman in the room. A year after my diagnosis with ACT UP supporting my determination to take what I'd learned, translate it, and share it with women that weren't in the room, my husband Daniel and I started an organization called World, Women Organized to Respond to Life-Threatening Diseases. It started out as just a Bay Area newsletter, But women with HIV and the people who loved them were so hungry for information and peer support that it quickly grew. In 1992, a year after the first newsletter was published, I went to my first International AIDS Conference in Amsterdam, where women from all over the world started the international community of women living with HIV. If you were there, you might remember that we all got up on stage and announced that we were women living with HIV, and then they called off every country that we were from, and people stepped forward and waved. World started holding retreats twice a year that grew to over 100 HIV-positive women. When the retreats were full, some women went and booked hotels in town and then just drove out to the retreat center for the workshop. And then women decided that since our providers never seemed to have enough time to educate us about our condition, we would do it ourselves. That's how a program called HIV University was born. Over the years, I joined numerous studies, AWARE, BARCWA, WISE, and many more. In 1994, I joined a study of long-term non-progressors at the NIH. I'm sharing this picture because I was sent this after the study, and I do think it's really, really, really important that you give the feedback to your study participants of what it is that you learned, even if we can't read a damn thing. At the time, I was losing a friend a week to AIDS. I remember being so desperate to help the scientists find a cure that when the surgeons couldn't palpate a lymph node that they were supposed to biopsy, I begged Dr. Fauci and a group of young scientists gathered around my bed to cut me open and dig around. He kindly informed me it wouldn't be ethical to just cut me open and dig around. A few weeks later, I heard a term I'd never heard before. Two terms, actually. My viral load was undetectable. Even as my friends were dying, I could not let go of the dream to have a baby. I stalked researchers at conferences, telling myself that I was reporting on HIV and pregnancy for world's readers, until eventually, in a story that's too long to share, but includes the results of the ACTG 076 study of AZT and pregnancy, and also includes me hounding many people in this room, my husband Daniel and I decided to start a family. We reached out to the Bay Area Perinatal AIDS Center at San Francisco General, where I got state-of-the-art preconception counseling and prenatal care. The doctor who delivered my baby is here. Actually, she delivered two. On March 12th, Sarah and Sophia completed our little family, and to this day, they are HIV negative and thriving. In 3 days, Sarah was sitting right there. I don't know if you want to give a wave. With the doctor who delivered her. In 3 days, Sarah will turn 29. My husband, who is also here, he doesn't want to stand up. We just celebrated our 40th anniversary, and he is still, hold on. I know, that's an achievement in itself, right? 40 years with one person, that is an achievement. I agree. But also, he is still HIV negative. The HIV positive people that you interact with need to know that they can have and deserve to have healthy, long, loving relationships, and that their partners can remain HIV negative and that they can have families. After my daughter's birth, I traveled the world talking to women who desperately wanted a family. One of those trips was to Uganda. The locals convinced me to speak to the media because they couldn't find positive women who were willing to speak on the record and have their photograph taken to talk about their HIV pregnancies. So I reluctantly agreed, and then this picture was sent to me years later because the article was still posted on a clinic wall in a rural village. By the time my children were born, I better talk fast, oh my God. I'd lost well over 300 loved ones to AIDS, but then at the international conference in Vancouver in the summer of 1996, something amazing happened. I stood in a dark room, and for the first time I saw the data of what happened when people living with HIV went on combination therapy with these new drugs called protease inhibitors. Their viral load dropped to undetectable and stayed there. I knew then that some of us would survive, but not without scars. I also knew it would require a tremendous effort to get the new drugs to all who wanted and needed them. Today, not only do we have long-term survivors, but there are lifetime survivors who acquired HIV at or shortly after birth. They too have suffered the unimaginable loss of many of their peers, yet found a way to continue blooming. In the United States, they call themselves the dandelions. A lot has happened since my diagnosis 35 years ago. HIV's gone from a death sentence to what should be a chronic, manageable disease. Today, we have so many drugs that work, I can no longer name them all. Upon diagnosis, my biggest fear was that my husband, who was uninsured, would become uninsurable. Because of the Affordable Care Act, it's no longer legal to discriminate against people who have pre-existing conditions. Women's participation in clinical trials has also improved. Though we still have a long way to go, the recent lenacapavir study is a notable achievement. But a lot hasn't changed, especially stigma. It's easy and dangerous to take all the progress for granted. Many of the more recently diagnosed people living with HIV have never known a time without the AIDS Drug Assistance Program, the Ryan White Care Act, or PEPFAR. But as longtime activist Lauren Jones used to say before she died, somebody fought for you to have that service, and if you don't fight to protect it, you could lose it. My mother used to give me a similar warning. Growing up, I could never imagine that women would lose the right to choose whether to continue or terminate a pregnancy. After all, the Supreme Court had already decided that we did have that right. But today, that right is no longer protected. Millions of lives have been saved. Marginalized groups have organized and finally been heard. But the backlash has been vicious. What? 2 minutes? Oh my God. I'm in trouble. I'm so sorry. Okay, so let's talk about what's happening now. You'll be able to get these slides later. Have you seen the news? Anybody feeling overwhelmed? We are 48 days into a new administration, and already the attacks on our most vulnerable people have shocked many of us with their rapidity and unnecessary cruelty. Our president has declared that only 2 genders exist. As one friend said, the administration doesn't just want to persecute us, they want to eliminate us, to exterminate us. Our president calls DEI illegal. How can diversity, equity, and inclusion be illegal? Immigration officials are embarking on mass deportations to Guantanamo in Central America. And since it's easier to catch the law-abiding people than the criminals they said they would deport, those are the people they're rounding up. A vaccine denialist who claimed HIV was caused by the gay lifestyle and poppers is now in charge of the Department of Health and Human Services. Hey, RFK, I never did poppers. And now government workers And now government workers and scientists and some of you and your colleagues are under attack. We know what it feels like to be attacked for who you are. And we stand with you. Even the most concise timeline of the chaos at USAID can barely fit on this slide. I'm glad that Chris Breyer, is that how you pronounce it? Close enough, he says. He'll be speaking to this tomorrow, so I'm going to go through some of this quickly because I'm running out of time. But here's what I want to say. The cruelty that we are seeing is intentional. The new head of OMB literally said, when they wake up in the morning, we want them to not go to work because they're increasingly viewed as the villains. We want their funding to be shut down. We want to put them in trauma. These are people's lives they're playing with. As just one example, I ask you to listen to this message from a 20-year-old woman living with HIV who has given her consent for me to share it with you. She shares the impact of the recent USAID PEPFAR cuts and the ongoing stigma against her and her peers.
Majorly, I can say all the adolescents, like right now, are in a panic. Same to me as well. I'm in a panic because we're about to have some shortages of drugs. And unfortunately, maybe the youth-friendly center will be closed because it was also being supported by USAID. So I don't know what we're going to do because our major challenge will be going to take our drugs from the main pharmacy where everybody takes their drugs, and there's a lot of discrimination there. Accidental disclosures can occur. So it's a big challenge. I'm also a bit scared going to take my medications from the main pharmacy, and we are not even guaranteed if that drugs will be there for. I just heard that the drugs that are remaining can last for 6 months, so we don't know for 6 months what's gonna happen. So people are really in a great panic. And then there's a lot of discrimination in social media. There's comments that can even make you cry. So many people are in a panic. Many people are just saying that they're just waiting for death, but I keep telling them that God will open another way.
There are still people after all these years who wonder if it would be better to die than to have people find out they have HIV. We have to change that. The recklessness we're seeing is like dropping an egg on the floor. You can't just pick it up and put it back the way it was. Many of us believe they started the assault on democracy by cutting programs that serve Africans, undocumented immigrants, and transgender kids because they thought that Americans would let them pick on the most vulnerable and they would get away with it, even if they broke the law, which they have many times. This is a coup. We have to stop it now. We have to fight back, and we have to call it what it is while we have a chance. I don't have time to go into the how they're going to be coming after Social Security and Medicaid, so I'll just point out my bill for Biktarvy, $12,000 for 3 months. Because of scientists, including many of you, millions of lives have been saved, but these advances will mean nothing if people can't access the treatment and care you've developed. What's a world look like when people can't get ART? I remember what it looked like 30 years ago, and it wasn't good. We can't go back. I can still remember the names of opportunistic infections like cryptosporidiosis, pneumocystis, cryptococcal meningitis, because every one of those words brings back the memory of a friend who is no longer here. I remember what cytomegalovirus can do to a person with a CD4 count under 50, because I watched a friend go blind overnight after her doctor, who was not an HIV specialist, told her she just needed less screen time. People are scared, and I get it. We have a president so punitive, even the congressional Republicans are afraid to speak up. And I understand that there are times when silence by individuals and organizations may protect people. But this stunning collective silence ensures that the abuses of power and assaults on our humanity will continue. We can already see examples. We can already see examples of people that silence did not serve at all. How many PEPFAR programs hunkered down, didn't utter a peep, and were cut anyway? So now is the time for moral courage. I beg of you, do not bend a knee in advance. Do not crumple in despair. That is exactly what they want you to do. What is happening today is not normal. Regardless of our income, education, connections, or HIV status, my experience has taught me that everyone has something to contribute. I'm grateful to the activists who have been acting up. There are things you can do. You can do things with your time. That QR code is for a demonstration that's happening tomorrow night right across the street in Yerba Buena Gardens at 6 o'clock. We will be demonstrating to stand up for science, and I hope you all will come. You can also give of your resources. And your expertise. Sorry, I'm missing a page. And I can't see. And of course, live a good life. There's a post-it I keep on my computer that I turn to in moments when I am unsure what to do or when I am afraid. It says, fear is a reaction, courage is a decision. Don't be afraid. Figure out what you can do, and then do it. Because someone once said to me, we need you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Going Antiviral. Catch up on earlier episodes wherever you listen to podcasts, and check out the video versions of this episode and others on the IAS-USA YouTube channel. You can find these links in the show notes, or simply go to YouTube and search for IAS-USA, and there they are. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review Going Antiviral on Apple Podcasts. This podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to serve as medical advice. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the IAS-USA or its affiliates. If you have a question you'd like answered on the show, you can send it to podcast@iasusa.org to be answered in a future episode.